Hi, history nerds. My name is Daniel Chatfield, and welcome to the first episode of the History and Games podcast. Or, I guess I should say this is the introduction episode. A good place to start if you're wanting to jump in and get up to speed with what we, or I, do here. First, a bit about me. I'm a 23-year-old guy from New Jersey currently living in Los Angeles. I have a degree in cinema and photography from Ithaca College, and in case it wasn't obvious enough, I am a giant nerd. I've been playing video games for as long as I can remember, and loving history for just as long. Personally, while I am partial to European classical and medieval history, I consider myself a student of human history, meaning that I love learning about all of what history has to offer. It doesn't matter where or when it's from. If it happened in the past, I'm interested. I actually give credit to video games for this, as in my opinion, video games are quite possibly the best way to get people interested in history. Putting a player in the shoes of someone experiencing or taking part in major historical events gives a perspective that we have never seen before. I can give you anecdotal stories of high school history classes where people who wouldn't have participated at all suddenly jumped at questions because they got the answer from Assassin's Creed. And that's where this podcast comes in. Let's get the big question out of the way. What is history in games? What's the point of this podcast exactly? Well, the short answer is discussing how history is handled and interpreted in video games. The long answer is this. History is one of the most important fields one can study. And yes, I'm being unabashedly biased in that statement, but I believe it to be true. Knowledge of the past and the context that provides for the world of today is so incredibly vital towards understanding the human experience. And I personally believe one of the best ways to experience and understand history is to play it out in video games. Media has always had an important role in our perception of history, dating all the way back to Homer when history was primarily told in theater, or mythological explanations for events dating back even further. Within the past couple hundred years, we have seen an explosion of new media and an evolution in how humans interact with media. Film and television became the primary sources of entertainment during the 20th century, and now I believe video games are quickly starting to take their place. And this is exacerbated by the current pandemic, with games being one of the few industries that has experienced growth where others have faltered. In the past, film and television have played a huge role in how we perceive history, in both positive and negative ways. It's made us more aware of the stories that history is able to provide, while at the same time showing how easy it is to misrepresent and harm our perception and understanding of history. Video games are liable to these follies as well. However, I feel that for a variety of reasons, they're the best way to tell historical stories. The goal of this podcast is to showcase ways that video games do history right and wrong, how games can do better in the future, how history is shown through the lens of an interactable medium, and so much more. I plan on talking about how games handle representation, historical influences in games, talking to experts about historical parts of games, and pitching historical games. And this is where you come in. I can't do all this on my own, and even if I could, it would be through the perspective of a white kid from New Jersey. And I don't know about you, but that sounds boring and lame as hell. I want to get a wide variety of guests to come on and talk about history the way they know how, getting a diverse and wide variety of people to come onto the show. History isn't meant to be viewed through the lens of one person or one race, because history is experienced by everyone, and it should be shown as such. If you don't want to come onto the show, but still want to contribute, I got you covered. One of the main segments on the show mentioned before is pitching games set in or related to history. Do you have an idea for a game set in history that you want to explore? Then please feel free to submit them to the History and Games Patreon or email at historyandgamespodcast@gmail.com. Please format the email with the subject line HIG pitch, followed by a description of the game, the time it is set in, and how the game would play. Patreon submissions will be prioritized, but if you have a great idea and have no bucks to toss my way, email it to me, and I'll give it a look. And this is probably a good time to bring up Patreon. Yes, I'm going to make a Patreon for this podcast, since that seems like the best way of managing the podcast while interacting with you, the audience. The Patreon is there in case you want to toss a couple bucks towards the podcast and submit pitches that, like I mentioned before, would be prioritized over email submissions. I'm gonna say it right now, I do not expect the Patreon thing to actually take off. At all. But on the off chance something comes out of it, it's still better to have than to not have it. At some point in the future, I might do tiers or fancy schmancy stuff for the Patreon, but like I said, don't expect much from it. Now, in case you're wondering how pitches should look, I'll submit my own and talk about what that would entail. History in Games Pitch. Julie d'Aubigny Open World RPG. Late 1600s, early 1700s. This would be an open world game based around the life of Julie d'Aubigny. D'Aubigny, also known as Madame de Maupin, and I apologize for any mispronunciations of these words, my French is terrible. D'Aubigny was an opera singer and fencer, and gallivanted around France, leaving incredible stories in her wake, from brawls and duels to seduction, disguise, and singing. At one point, Julie fell in love with a woman during her tenure in the opera, and when her lover was sent to a convent, Julie replaced her body with a dead nun, and proceeded to burn the whole place down. Perhaps the two of them riding off into the sunset, or so I'd like to imagine. I'm a romantic. Unfortunately, Julie d'Aubigny's life can be described as the fire that burns twice as bright lasts half as long. Julie's story officially ends in 1707, where at the age of 33, she died, having entered a convent and living her last few years away from the rest of society. While some may mark this as the ending of an incredible life, I think this is the perfect place to begin her story in a video game. After all, one of the issues of having your main character being a known historical figure is adhering to history as the template of your story. You end up writing yourself into a corner in order for your story to make sense with the timeline, much similar to writing prequel stories. Our story would have Julie fake her death after growing bored of the convent, as she dons a disguise and charges back into the world of 1700s France, which at this point in time was going through huge changes. France at this point was one of the most populated countries in all of Europe, experiencing a cultural shift from a previously rural society to a more urban one. At the time the story takes place, France is embroiled in the wars of Spanish succession, the waning years of Louis XIV, and perhaps the beginning years of his successor, Louis XV. As an aside, French royalty naming conventions are the worst. Hell, at this point, France didn't even have French as the official main language throughout the country. The southern region spoke Occitan languages, and even by 1790, only about half the country spoke French. Throughout the game, the player would travel throughout France, participating in duels, operas, and exploring the previous life of Julie as the main focus of the story. Julie d'Aubigny's sexuality and gender would be a primary focus of the story, as she is confronted by the patriarchal society she lives in and how she chooses to fight back against it. I feel that for this reason, setting the game in an open-world version of early 1700s France would be the best way for the player to experience the story, trekking across the country with side quests and collectibles, perhaps a few moments similar to the Assassin's Creed games, where you run across and interact with famous figures during this time. The gameplay loop would include combat such as fencing, with small-scale battles and duels being the primary focus of the combat side of gameplay. Opera performances would provide the player with a non-combat option of advancing throughout the game, with both options gaining Julie d'Aubigny more fame as she advances throughout the game. And that's a quick rundown of the kind of pitch I would like for the show, and I personally have many more ideas where that came from. Keep in mind, I don't ever expect these pitches to become games. After all, it's infinitely easier to talk about games than to make one. The goal of these pitches is more to draw attention to what history can provide for us when it comes to building and setting a game. But more importantly, I want to hear the historical games you want made and how they would play. I want this podcast to be an exploration of how games and history can interact with each other, and together, I think that's perfectly doable. As far as episode formats and release schedules go, I want to do weekly episodes, about 30 to 45 minutes in length, with guest episodes clocking in at around an hour. Expect new episodes to be out on Mondays, maybe a bit later if I need to edit it a lot. Unfortunately, I can't get guests for every episode. That'd be around 40-ish guests a year. And yes, I know there are 52 weeks in a year, but let's be realistic, y'all aren't getting 52 episodes a year. I plan for the episodes to be split into 2 sections. One half of the episode would be devoted to the topic of that episode. The second half would be historical game pitches, where you, I, or a guest would pitch their historical game and discuss it. Ideally, I would prefer the pitches to be related to the topic of the episode, though that won't always be the case, especially if the subject matter is specifically regarding parts of history that shouldn't be represented in games. For the most part, the episodes will be audio-based, available on YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts, potentially coming to more services when I figure out how the hell to do that. If you want to follow the social accounts, you can find them at Twitter and Instagram at HIG Podcast. I can't promise I'll post a lot on Instagram, but I'll be sure to put out tweets when new episodes are out. And that's it for the introduction episode. If you listened all the way to the end, I don't think I can thank you enough. Seriously. I know the phrase, "it means so much to me," is a little overplayed, but the fact that people are even slightly interested in this is absolutely incredible to me. I am so incredibly passionate about history and video games. I love talking about both those things in great detail, and I hope I can talk with you about these topics more in the future. Until then, so long, history nerds, and do good things.